This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, or so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Welcome to the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with your host, David Charlton. In today's episode, I speak to a well-qualified guest, Richard Dorney. Richard served in the military for almost 39 years, and he has a wealth of experience in dealing with high-pressure situations. He's now the director of Strongmind Resilience Training, a company that works to improve mental health support and trauma management and resilience, mainly in public sector organisations who are exposed to stress and trauma. Richard goes on to share his background, lessons he's learned throughout his career. We discuss resilience development and leadership in the military, trauma risk management, i.e. TRIM, in the military and in healthcare and corporate settings. It's a really fascinating listen. Hi Richard, would you be able to explain to the listeners a little bit about your background?
Hi, David. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, absolutely. So, long and boring story. My background is in the military. So I served just shy of 39 years in the military. Joined when I was 16, left when I was 55. So I never really had a proper job. It was all spent in green. And I did all those normal things that you would expect during that time operationally. Northern Ireland, Bosnia, First Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, those type of things. But in the later part of my career, I started to get involved with trauma risk management. And I set up and ran the Army Trauma Risk Management Program, which is still endures today and is still doing good work. And then when I left the military about 7 years ago, I founded Strongmind Resiliency Training. And so what we tried to do is to use some of that military expertise around trauma management and spread that out into other organisations who work in high-stress environments. And we do some much wider stuff as well around resilience and general mental health awareness. So I'm very much background in the military, really.
In terms of resilience and in a military setting, what is your definition there?
It's a difficult one, really. I think when I talk about resilience, I normally fall back on Anne Maston's definition, which I think is making positive positive adjustments in challenging life circumstances. And I like that because it kind of implies that there's something you need to do. So resilience isn't innate. It isn't just something you have. You develop it, you build it. And it's absolutely about our behaviours and the way we think about problems as well. It's crucial stuff. And I think that applies quite well to the military environment as well, because they have a very different approach to resilience in the military, I think, to the civilian world.
Want to expand on that and just explain what their approach is?
Sure. Well, I think the thing you need to understand fundamentally is that the mission comes first in the military. So you have to achieve the mission. And of course, the organisation accepts, they don't want it, but they accept that casualties are a reality, both physical casualties and psychological casualties. So the mission comes first. So the welfare of the individual, whilst it's important, it isn't front and centre. You have to achieve the mission first. So that's rather different to most organisations where the mission might be a priority, but actually it's kind of life or death stuff. So that's a fundamental difference that affects resilience. And of course, the focus has to be on the preservation of fighting power, i.e. capability. And what the military does very well is it understands what we call the moral component of fighting power. So people are capability. And if you don't look after your people and your people break unnecessarily, then your fighting power is eroded. So the maintenance of that is really important. And so as a result of that, and I think the military does this much better than anywhere else, leadership in the military is very good. And they invest a great deal of time and effort in training their leaders. And literally at every stage, there's some sort of leadership development, every stage. And pastoral care and welfare is absolutely ingrained in leadership. So commanders are absolutely expected to look after their people properly. even at the most junior levels, you put your people first above yourself. And I think that's something that is lacking in many other areas. So you do see some places where it's done quite well. In others, and they'll remain nameless, it's not done very well. But generally speaking, I think the military does that pretty well. But so resilience in the military is about physical and psychological resilience. The two go hand in hand. You need to be physically robust, but then encouraging people psychologically is important. And I said earlier that the military accepts that it's going to take casualties. But when we're talking about psychological casualties, this is, again, something I think the military does quite well, and it's not done as well on the outside, is they apply the principles of military psychiatry: proximity, immediacy, expectancy. And the expectancy element is about encouraging your people to be robust and to accept and expect that people will manage. People will cope with adversity, even the most horrible things. And we do know from research, if you look at traumatic stress, the number of people who go on to develop full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder is much lower. So people are impacted by trauma, of course they are, but actually the numbers who go on to develop a mental health disorder is a much smaller group. So the military accepts that some of those people, will be profoundly impacted, but actually it tries to create this attitude about resilience in the individual. And they even do that now in recruit training, which is a relatively new innovation. But what falls out of that, of course, is early intervention. It's spotting people and those who are in trouble. It's about getting those to clinical support where it's necessary.
In a way, I think what you've done is cleared up a myth for people who think that in military settings, fear cultures exist. That sounds very much the opposite.
Well, fear is an interesting thing, isn't it? And people used to refer to PTSD as a fear-based diagnosis, really. And of course, we now know that it isn't. I mean, you don't necessarily have to experience fear to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. There are all sorts of secondary elements that can result in PTSD. But in the military, there's much more so about that stuff. But yeah, I think it comes down to the leadership thing again, looking after your people. And I think there'll always be bad examples, but I think generally the military does that very well. And there are lots of outside myths around, PTSD rates and, suicide rates and all that kind of stuff. We hear lots and lots and lots about, suicide in the military. And the reality is that since the 1980s, the suicide rate in the military has been declining. Until the last few years, there's been a bit of a blip. It's up again. But actually, the rates have always been lower than the national average. In other words, you were safer in uniform than out. And now, actually, it's worsened significantly. But actually, the rates are kind of on a par with civilian rates.
Okay, so that would back up the fact that the leadership and the general culture is a more supportive and encouraging one.
Absolutely. And there is something about the period post-operations as well. The Americans saw this, I think, in Vietnam. 5 years after the Vietnam War, there was a sort of a rise in the suicide rates. And I think we're sort of seeing that in the military at the moment. And that's so, I talk about the military, I'm talking about serving military. So often people mix the two up, veterans and military. They're not the same thing. The picture with veterans, I think, is not quite as clear. But I think the evidence suggests really that the rates are pretty similar to those in civilian life.
You've mentioned to me off air that you've worked in Northern Ireland, Gulf War, Iraq, Bosnia, Afghanistan. Are you able to share some moments of extreme stress and pressure that you've had to deal with personally?
Yeah, and I try not to sort of pull up a sandbag and swing the lantern, But yeah, I mean, I take a whole host of events. I think probably for me, and I was probably about 32 at the time, where one of my soldiers was shot dead by a sniper in Northern Ireland. And there's something about being on a British street with people doing their shopping and cars driving past when a young man has been shot dead. And I was with him when he died, did first aid and so on. That was pretty challenging stuff. But what was interesting, we talked about this leadership thing. I was in a pretty crucial leadership role at the time. And so I didn't have time to sort of, sit and have a cry about all of this. We had over 100 soldiers that needed sorting out, and the mission had to be maintained. You can't all stop because you've taken a casualty, So life goes on, as it were, and you sort of put it behind you. And what I saw actually in that company, or small small portion of that company afterwards was a real impact of stress and trauma. So I think one or two of those people did go on to develop PTSD, but quite a lot of people were profoundly impacted by it. And what's interesting as well is not necessarily all of the people who were there at the scene. So there were some of those who were close to the guy who was killed, who weren't even in the same village at the time, who went on to have all sorts of issues with guilt and blame and all this sort of stuff, which is pretty standard stuff with trauma. But that was a difficult period, and for me too, actually. And I think it probably took me about a year to get over it. And I'm talking about attitudes, thinking, and behaviour. So I was very angry, I think, in that period. I didn't have PTSD, I didn't think I had, but I was quite angry in that period. And there was a friend of mine who sort of took me aside and said, you know what, you need to sort yourself out because, you're going down a risky road here with the way you're behaving. So I'm paraphrasing here. And actually it was interesting because his brother had been killed sort of 10 years, 15 years earlier in the same place, interestingly, in the same village, under very similar circumstances. And he said, this ripped my family apart. I saw it, and you need to sort yourself out. And that had a profound impact on me. And I think it was at that stage I sort of realised that you have a choice, don't you? To quote Viktor Frankl, life can throw anything at you. The only thing it can't take from you is your ability to choose how you respond. And to me, that's absolutely true. And whilst I didn't realise all that at the time, I think that conversation for me was a game changer. And I realised that I did have a choice. I could pull myself together, as it were.
I'm sorry to hear that you were obviously put in that spot and in the way that that happened. You think that period then went on to shape what your motivation for getting into trauma?
Undoubtedly, I think. Sometimes you're standing on the right floor when the elevator doors open, aren't you? And opportunity presents. And that's kind of what happened to me in the military, I think, the opportunity to, shape the trauma risk management program much later on. But having that in my background, and that was by no means the only thing, there were lots of other things that went on. But having those sorts of operational experiences, I think they do shape you. Yeah. So that's at the root of it, I guess.
Would you like to explain to the listeners a little bit more about trauma risk management, certainly in the way it was approached in the military, and obviously now I know you go on to use it in other workplaces and different settings?
Sure. So trauma risk management, or TRIM, it was developed originally in Royal Marines, and I was sort of in 20 years ago when this was in its infancy, and then had the opportunity to develop it in the Army. In a nutshell, there is very good evidence around peer support or wider social support, and that is probably the biggest protective factor that there is for mental health. And so peer support in military settings is a crucial element of that. And there's very good research that, in challenging circumstances, who is a soldier going to speak to? Not just a soldier, but anybody, frankly. Who's the first person you're going to speak to when you're in trouble? And all the evidence suggests it's a trusted peer. It's not a clinician, it's not a chaplain, it's not a welfare officer. It's a trusted peer. So the principle of TRIM is a peer-delivered intervention, evidence-based, which provides a framework for a conversation that allows for risk assessment. So in a nutshell, a TRIM practitioner would sit down with a colleague, have an open and honest conversation with them around a particular framework. And what they're attempting to do is identify the risk factors, the common risk factors for the development of post-traumatic stress. And where it differs from other interventions, so it's not psychological debriefing, which we know is potentially harmful. So it's not a single intervention. What we do is we do it a month later. So you have a benchmark 3 days after the event, and you do it again a month later. And what you're doing is you're checking in with that person and having a look at what their recovery looks like. Because what we do know is that what happens to a person in the post-incident recovery period is crucial, and not being exposed to further trauma or further stress, whatever that looks like, in that period as well. So you've got this 1 month check-in, and at that point, you can make a really good assessment of how that person's getting on. Most people, not necessarily over it, but they are doing pretty well, actually. They're dusting themselves off. But what you can do is identify those people who are really not doing well and get them signposted on for professional support as and when it's needed. And interestingly, lots of those people, in my experience, it's what's happened to them afterwards that tends to be the crucial factor rather than the incident itself. And so you can apply this to all sorts of civilian organisations as well. We work with police, we've looked in the NHS, we've looked in the rail industry and security and all sorts of other areas. So it's a very flexible and an effective system.
So as you say, one of the crucial elements there is towards the end of not towards the end of the process, but during that process is actually going on to signpost them to relevant professionals who can maybe use psychological interventions to
Absolutely.
support as well.
Absolutely. So again, my experience, having done this on operations for a long time, is and done it with soldiers who have seen their friends killed on operations and wounded and have narrowly escaped death themselves. And you sit down with them, and yes, early on they can be very, very upset, and and then the following day they're thrown back into the fray because none of them ever say, "I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this." That's just not the way they work. They will always, crack on. And that's one of the reasons why the follow-up is so important. Is that person now coping, or is all that additional stress making things worse? And do they need intervention? And extreme circumstances, do we need to pull this person from the role that they're in? And interestingly, seeing this with the NHS, over the last 2 years, we've worked a lot inside the NHS, and people have been exposed to horrendous levels of stress and trauma. It's not unusual to have people, telling stories and crying on courses with us, I remember I had one sister who said, I'm no stranger to death, but when you lose 5 patients in one shift, that's not normal, and you can absolutely empathise and see why that's a problem. So having something in place like TRIM, where people can have those structured conversations and essentially facilitate early intervention, really, really important. And likewise in the police, we've seen it there as well.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the last couple of years with COVID, I can imagine, in the NHS has been horrific for some of the staff to deal with.
But there's been some quality research done actually, and there was one done between the two major lockdowns, and they surveyed about 6,000 people. And the good news was, I think about 49% of them actually were doing pretty well. So they had a lot more that followed on after that, of course. But about 49% of them were doing pretty well. But the remaining group, actually, the rates of anxiety, depression, PTSD was a big issue. Substance misuse was an issue, and I think about 13%. And worryingly, there were quite a lot of people, much smaller number, but significant amount of people who, had suicidal ideation as well. So there's just under half of people have been profoundly impacted. And it's systems like TRIM that will provide support and pick those people up and make sure, that they get the help they need.
Yeah, because as you say, it's gone on for such a long time. It's not like they've just had one episode. This is just a repeat, I suppose, a number of times.
Well, and that's a significant difference that we see with the police and the NHS with the military. So the military will go on an operation, usually for about 6 months. It's generally quite high intensity with casualties. It's very challenging. Then the military comes back. There's a period of decompression. There's a period of normalization. And then most of them don't deploy on operations for a set period. So there is recovery space. You don't get that in the NHS. There is no recovery space. You've got your annual leave, and that is it. So people are stuck in this perpetual cycle of operating in a high stress environment with very limited resources. Same with the police. Limited resources, fewer officers, and they're in real trouble. I take my hat off to both of those organisations and the way that people deal with it. But we need to accept there's a price to pay. If you leave people in that zone of high distress for long periods of time, there's a price to pay for that at the end.
You mentioned a little bit earlier there about it was in the military setting how people will hold their hands up after a high stress episode, and they'll want to continue and keep on going. You also mentioned about the importance of the structured conversations with regards to TRIM. Now, I'm intrigued. The name of your company is Strongmind Resiliency Training. Yeah. Well, in your mind, what is a strong mind, I suppose?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. This is something I've considered on a number of occasions. So Strongmind, I think, is about, for me, it's about, mental resilience, absolutely in your field. It's about being robust. It's about thinking, attitude and behavior. It's about expectancy and trying to be strong. It could be misinterpreted because if there's strength, some people will perceive that there's weakness, and then you must be weak if you don't kind of survive that episode psychologically. But that's not where we're coming from. What we want to encourage is the attitude of a strong mind, of a robust mind. We absolutely accept that, there's no weakness around mental health, because the last thing we want to do is stigmatize. So this is about mental robustness, basically, and encouraging people to understand. And I think the fundamental part of that is self-awareness, is understanding the way you think and behave, and what's in your past, and how your actions impact on other people, and all that sort of stuff. So that's where we're sort of coming from with the name of the company.
And in some ways, that there's a strength in actually saying, sorry, but I'm not going to be able to do this. Or
absolutely,
can I speak to someone about it?
Absolutely, yeah. Or even as a leader, having the moral courage to say to senior leadership, look, these people need more support. This isn't working well. And on trim courses, we talk about psychologically informed management. So understanding the way people respond to high stress environments and trauma, and rather than what tends to happen is people just say, "Are you okay? Are we all right? Are we all okay? All happy to go on?" In a group environment, what happens? People go, "Yeah, fine, of course," and then they go away, shut themselves away, and have a bit of a cry. So psychologically informed management is about strong empathetic leadership, sitting down with people, looking people in the eye, demonstrating to them that you understand and that you care about what's going on, and that you've got their back and you're going to fight their corner. And that's difficult in under-resourced organisations that are fast-moving, I know, but it is so, so important.
You've helped me here signpost you to the next question. So I was going to ask you about the importance of mental health awareness, and essentially what you're talking about there is really going to have a positive impact on someone's mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we do know, so a couple of things. So peer support, we know or social support is a protective factor, is really, really important. Encouraging people to, talk about their issues and provide them with informed, guidance and information. That's really, really important stuff. But I think in terms of awareness, just getting people to understand that they do have an element of control. The way they think and behave, they can influence that. But just being able to recognize when people aren't doing well. We're not talking about diagnosis here. We don't want people to be diagnosing anxiety and depression and all sort of common mental health disorders, but understanding them is important, so that you can detect when something is going wrong, and knowing how to have those conversations with colleagues. And if you're a manager, particularly, one of the things we've done is developed a mental health for managers course, where we talk about how you have those difficult conversations and how to recognise those common mental health problems and so on.
Yeah, and that must be gold, I suppose, for managers, because often managers are promoted into those roles on the back of being good at their job, and they don't necessarily have those softer skills in some cases.
Absolutely right. And those soft skills are lacking. And, stigma is high in some businesses as well. And people are a bit scared. I mean, it's a bit scary when you've had no training to engage in these conversations. The other thing that people don't understand quite often is that they have a legal and statutory responsibility to look after their people. And that's not something I'm just inventing. The Equality Act clearly applies to people with mental health problems as well as physical health challenges. And, if an employee is struggling, you can't just look the other way, And if that means reasonable adjustments or considering reasonable adjustments, then they need to do that. But the law does dictate that organisations need to look after their people. And sadly, there are lots of examples of where that's gone wrong and has ended up in litigation because they've been found in breach of the Equality Act. And that might be the actions of an individual manager inside a large organisation. And it can cost hundreds of thousands of pounds in some cases. So I think a little bit of understanding and education is gold, actually.
I suppose that you mentioned the word litigation there. That'll be a key factor in why some people are a bit anxious about having conversations, or they're a bit anxious about looking at mental health as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But these are misconceptions, aren't they? Because there's that old term, isn't there? A problem shared is a problem halved. Generally, when people talk about their problems and they're received by people empathetically in a considerate way, it helps. So you're not necessarily fixing the problem. You're not necessarily curing their problem. But what you're doing is listening. And that in itself is gold. It's really, really important to do that. I couldn't emphasize that enough, really. It's so important just to be empathetic and be kind to people.
Massively. You're taking me back a good few years now. So
Prior to being married now, I was married to Alex, who sadly got cancer, and she later died. And there was times where we came out of the hospital, and all I could do was listen and hug her. Basically, there was nothing could be said to do that. And sometimes in those type of situations, you really just want to problem solve, don't you? And tell someone, you just can't do that.
But I think, and I'm really sorry for your loss to hear that. I didn't know that, but I think just looking someone in the eye and being there and demonstrating that you care before you even say anything. I mean, that is so, so powerful. And then inside, an occupational setting, having a manager who's prepared to sit down and look you in the eye is really important. One of the things we say with Trim as well, we teach people how to do what we call psychological briefings after trauma. So for people who are not necessarily going to get one of these risk assessments, it's an education brief to people. And there is no substitute for somebody quite senior with responsibility to stand in front of the workforce and to look them in the eye, explain what's happened, not necessarily in too much detail, just explain what has happened and to, take some degree of responsibility. It's what in the military we used to call, we always hated, command by email. When somebody sends you a sympathetically worded email, it means nothing. It means nothing. You get off your backside and go and speak to people. That's gold. And people might not necessarily remember that you did it, but I'll tell you what, they will remember when you don't do it. Most definitely. And you hear this over and over again.
And essentially by working in that sort of way, you respect, you feel valued, and then you're going to trust people as well.
Exactly.
Those three things are going to come out.
Exactly.
In terms of threes, I'd like to wrap this conversation up. It's been fascinating, really insightful. Would you
I've enjoyed it.
Me too. Would you be able to share with the listeners three takeaways from the conversation?
Yeah, sorry, you wrong-footed me with that, and you did ask me to do that previously. But yeah, so I would say, first of all, don't underestimate the power of peer support. A kind word with a colleague is really, really important. So the value of peer support. I think the importance as well of informed, empathetic, and compassionate leadership, absolutely crucial. And I think to have some degree of awareness around how people respond to high-stress environments, particularly where it's predictable, in policing and the NHS. These things are to be expected. So planning for them and understanding them really important. So those would be the three things I think I would leave with them.
That's brilliant. A big thank you. Where can the listeners reach out to you if they want to have a conversation or get in touch with you?
Sure. So we've got a website, www.strongmindresilience.co.uk. Or if you want to drop me an email, if you want to send it to info@strongmindresilience.co.uk, then I will get back to you. I'd be delighted to come along to your organisation and deliver some training for you.
Excellent. Well, yeah, those notes will go in the show notes for people should they want to get in touch with you. As I say, I've really enjoyed this, Richard, and a big thank you for your time.
Likewise, David. Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So then, that was a really enjoyable episode to record. I have to admit, I felt a little bit out of my comfort zone at times there. It's an area that I'm reading up on all of the time, is life in the military and how the military support their employees. And it's clear from what Richard was saying that it's a domain sporting and corporate organisations can learn an awful lot from. There's a lot of good work being carried out these days. However, reports like the recent one from British Gymnastics really do highlight the need for a nice balance between challenging and supporting individuals, and also a better understanding of what supporting individuals actually looks like. This is a must. And until next time, where we're going to have another excellent guest, I really wish and hope you have a great week. And if you do have a spare minute or two, please feel free to give the podcast a positive rating on Apple. It really does help us continue to make a positive difference to people's lives, which is what this podcast is all about. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.